Hello and welcome to Tech Deals. Are you looking for a basic entry-level motherboard for an AMD Ryzen processor, but you still want the option to overclock and have a quality board? Stop, you've come to the right place. This is the MSI B350M Gaming Pro motherboard, $80. Very inexpensive board, but still nicely made by MSI. Now, next to it, I have here the AMD Ryzen 5 1400 processor. That is the CPU I would recommend for this board. If you want more CPU, I would actually buy more board than this, and I'll talk about that in a second. But if you're trying to put together a budget machine, if you're upgrading from something older or simply putting together your first PC for the first time and you're looking to save some money, a $160 CPU and an $80 motherboard still gives you amazing performance. It is worth noting that even the entry-level Ryzen 5 1400 is still a 4-core 8-thread chip and will still provide excellent performance. And you can overclock this CPU on this motherboard. Now, you may need to replace the cooler this comes with if you want to overclock it by very much. I will be doing a build video series with this board and this CPU for that very reason. I want to find out how much the entry-level included cooler will overclock the Wraith Stealth cooler rather than the Wraith Spire cooler, which comes with the higher end chips. And then I might even put something like a Hyper 212 Evo from Cooler Master on it to see how much better that does. I imagine it'll get much better results. Now, this motherboard does have some good features, but please keep in mind it is still limited. It's an $80 board. Later in this video, I'll talk about what you get at the $100 and $120 price points if you want to spend a bit more. But basically, this board has got a Realtek audio chip, a Realtek Gigabit Ethernet LAN chip, one video card slot, 2 memory slots, but it does support up to 32 gigabytes of RAM, which is absolutely plenty for the average user. Frankly, 16 gigabytes is really all you need to install. And it's got the requisite serial ATA ports, it's got the USB 3.0 and 3.1 ports, and it even has an M.2 slot, which does in fact fully support the new NVMe solid-state drive. So if you want to put really fast storage in it, you certainly can. It also gets you into the Ryzen platform, which you can certainly upgrade to a faster CPU in the future. But as I'll discuss in a minute, if you think you're going to do that in the next couple of years, I would strongly encourage you spend maybe $20 to $40 more for a little bit higher end board. That being said, there are no other options for an $80 overclockable board from the blue team over at Intel. The fact that AMD has made an $80 motherboard available in a $160 CPU with 8 threads that's overclockable is awesome. And if you're looking to put together a budget machine, I think this is going to be a nice one. So if you are not subscribed to my channel, please be sure to subscribe because you'll get notifications of when my upcoming build video series in this, where I look for value for the money. This combination here is all about the deal. It's all about how much performance can we get for spending as little as possible. And yes, I'll do some overclocking on it as well, both on the included cooler as well as on a $25 to $35 cooler, probably something like a Hyper 212 Evo or something similar. Now, before I get into the specifics of this motherboard, I want to talk about the Ryzen chipsets in general. There are 3 mainstream chipsets. The X370 is on the top, the B350 is in the middle, and then the A320 is on the bottom. There's actually 2 others for small form factor and custom machines, but those aren't important for today's video. So this is the middle of the road mainstream chipset. Briefly, the X370 chipset, the one on the top, it primarily has more USB ports, more serial ATA ports, and the ability to support 2 graphics cards, for example, 2 NVIDIA cards in SLI. Now, the mainstream B350 chipset does technically on some boards, although not this one, support 2 AMD cards in Crossfire, but not very well. You should get an X370 if you want to do that. This does support 4 serial ATA ports, plus up to 2 NVMe solid-state drives, M.2 drives, and it does support a wide variety of USB 3.1, 3.0, and 2.0 ports, plenty for most people. It does support overclocking RAM, so this will support up to DDR4 3200 MHz RAM, and that's a nice feature of the mainstream AMD chipsets. The mainstream Intel chipsets, such as the B250 board, see what AMD did there, does not support overclocking a RAM, so a B250 board on Intel only supports DDR4 2400, whereas the mainstream B350 board from AMD does support overclocking a RAM up to DDR4 3200. Depending upon your RAM, of course. Different RAM kits will run at different speeds. There's never a guarantee, but you at least have the option. Now, this does allow you to overclock your CPU. Both the X370 and the B350 allow all Ryzen chips to be overclocked, meaning you can run them faster at the listed speed. Now, that's going to depend upon the design of your motherboard, the power delivery system. That's going to depend upon your cooling solution for your chip, and of course, it's going to depend upon something called the silicon lottery. How good is your specific chip? When they test these chips, each one is guaranteed to run at the out-of-the-box clock speed. It's not guaranteed to run more, although most will. So how much over the out-of-the-box clock speed you get is going to depend upon the quality of your chip, the quality of your board, the quality of your cooling, and maybe a little bit of luck tossed in. Something to keep in mind when you are planning or counting on overclocking. If you would like better guaranteed overclocking or a higher out-of-the-box clock speed, you can spend $20 to $30 more on the Ryzen 5 1500X rather than the 1400. Two changes. Number one, you get a 3.7 gigahertz out-of-the-box turbo speed rather than 3.4, and you get a Wraith Spire cooler instead of a Wraith Stealth. The actual cooler itself is larger and can actually cool the chip more effectively. There's also XFR, which is auto overclocking. The 1500X will auto overclock itself if you're only using one or two cores up to as much as 3.9 gigahertz, whereas this will only overclock itself up to 3.5 as it comes out of the box. However, both chips are very similar, and with good cooling, you can overclock both very well. Now that's the B350 chipset. The A320 is the only mainstream consumer chipset that AMD offers that does not allow manual overclocking. The XFR automatic overclocking still works, but you cannot adjust the clock speeds further. It generally is designed for large OEMs for pre-built machines, although many companies are choosing to go ahead and put the B350 in because the price difference isn't that large. So you can spend somewhere in the $60 range, or about $20 less than this board, on an A320 chipset-based board, but then you can't do any overclocking. Do I think it's worth it? Not really. Frankly, I think the B350 is what most people should buy if you're going to custom build your own computer. So skip the A320, at least get a B350 for $80, good features, good expansion options, because you do lose other things on the A320 besides just the overclocking. Fewer USB ports, fewer PCI Express lanes, fewer M.2 support. There's just less all-around features, so skip that and get a B350. Okay, that's enough talking and overview. How about we open this up and take a look inside, shall we? I'll move that just a bit over. Now, as I said before, this is an $80 motherboard, but that does not mean that it's completely bare bones. It has some very nice features in it. Now, I'm going to put the board aside and we're going to look at what comes in the box, and then we'll take a look at the board. It is situated in a cardboard tray here in an anti-static bag. And I'm just going to set that whole thing over here. And first, let's take a look at what's in the box. We have two serial ATA cables. Pretty basic, pretty straightforward, but nice to have that you've got two of them. That's probably enough for most people who are looking at a board of this level. We have a driver CD. Now, if you can get online, go to MSI's website and download any needed drivers there. They're going to be more up to date than anything on this CD, but if you're temporarily offline or you can't get online for whatever reason, then you can certainly use this. Please note that Windows 10 will auto-install most of the drivers you need. You don't generally need to install very many drivers these days. Windows 10 is pretty good about it. You might want to consider downloading the updated Realtek audio drivers and perhaps the Realtek LAN drivers, which you can find on MSI's website if you're interested, and of course also update the BIOS to the latest version. We have something very handy. These are cable management stickers. Basically, it provides you a place to write on both sides here, and you wrap these around your cables. It's nothing complicated or fancy, but if you're building in a case where it's hard to trace the cables and you have a few cables plugged into the board and then a few maybe around the back, this just provides you a way to label both ends of, say, your serial ATA cables or power cable. Nice extra feature. Thank you for purchasing. Please register your product. Actually, this is a good opportunity to do so. MSI provides excellent warranty and customer service, but you have to input your serial number and register your product at their website. If you do so, you don't have to worry about looking it up later. Now, you can find the serial number on the board, but once it's in your computer, that's no fun to get. You can also find it on the box right here. So you can register your product and then it's there if you ever need it in the future. Quick installation guide. Now there will be an upcoming full build video here. So if you've never installed a motherboard before, check that video out when it posts. It's probably not going to be for a couple of weeks from when you watch this, but it will be coming sometime this summer, where I go step by step, putting this into a case, putting the CPU on it, putting the cooler on it, putting RAM, cables, SSD, and everything else into a detailed build video that you can follow step by step. But if you're in a hurry and you don't want to wait, that's what this is for. This is the short version of how to plug everything in. Now, if you have already built many computers in the past, this may be redundant, you may not need it, but everybody has to build their first computer at some point. And so if you've never built one before, for example, this shows diagrams on how to insert the CPU. Now, I strongly recommend, if you don't watch one of mine, watch somebody's tutorial and how-to video on YouTube. Watching a video is much better than a diagram, but hey, this works offline, so it's nice to have. We have a manual, and it's actually a fairly small manual compared to the much larger manuals of the bigger boards, but it's fairly thick, and okay, yeah, fair enough, it's written in 37 different languages. And the amount of information on this board is pretty thin. But it does contain the important information. It's written very small, so hopefully you can read it. But it does have information in here, for example, what the pinouts for everything on the board is. Here's the front panel connector page right here on page 10. So for connecting your reset switch, power LED, hard drive activity LED, power switch to the motherboard, there's those little teeny cables you got to plug in. This shows you the diagram of where to plug them in. It has other information in here such as RAM support and so on and so forth, so be sure to keep your manual. Memory module installation. Now, this is more important on a motherboard with 4 memory slots, and of course you can tell this is generic because it shows 4 memory slots and this board has 2. But it's important to note that it does matter which order you install the RAM in, although in this case you're going to be installing 2 memory modules. I don't recommend one. I would put them in 2 because you get dual channel memory. It runs twice as fast. And then finally, we have, oh, I'm glad this, nice. We have our I/O shield, and it's silkscreen and it's black. Very, very nice. Let me go ahead and open this up and show this to you. This is the I/O shield that has to be installed in your ATX case. Now, I/O shields seem to be pretty simple. What's the big deal? Well, I like the fact that they've made it black. So if you have a black tower case, for too many of these are silver and they stick out like a sore thumb. So if you care about such things, it's black and it's silk screened and it's printed not just with the MSI Gaming Series logo, but actually with all what the items are. This is your speaker out. This shows you the microphone in, the line in port, your super speed ports, and so on. So basically it's quality. You're getting a cut above the basic generic boards. This is just an example of how they do that. Now there is nothing else in the box, so I will go ahead and close this back up. And now we're going to take a look at the board itself. Do keep in mind when handling electronic components, this is just a cardboard thing, I'll set down here for the moment. When handling electronic components, make sure that you're grounded. You need to touch some metal. Sometimes even the doorknobs or the door frame or of your house will work really well, or touch your power supply or case. Something large in metal to take out any static electricity in your body so that you don't put it into your electrical components. And now we will take this out of the anti-static bag. Be sure to keep the anti-static bags if you ever need to transport it, ship it, send it in for warranty. You will need an anti-static bag. Now here we have the actual motherboard itself. This is a micro ATX board or a mini ATX board depending upon how you want to call it. There is only one video card slot right down here, so it's not hard to figure out where to install your graphics card. This board does not support more than one, and you shouldn't be buying an $80 board if you want to do that anyway. So one graphics card goes here. One thing I like is right below it is here is your M.2 slot. Want to install a solid state drive right onto the board without messing with cables? You can do that. Do you want to put a fast drive such as 888's SX8000 or the Samsung 960 EVO? you can do that as well. Full support for that. Down here, we have a USB 3.0 front panel header. So for the front of your case, that's where you're going to plug the cable for your USB 3.0 ports. We have 4 serial ATA ports right here, 1, 2, and then 3, 4 over here on the side for either hard drives or solid state drives, 24-pin power connector. You have your 2 DDR4 memory module slots, and for most people buying this type of CPU on this type of motherboard, I would recommend 16 gigs of RAM, 2 8-gig modules installed in a pair, DDR4 3200. Even if your particular RAM doesn't like 3200, it'll still probably run at 2933 or 2666, somewhere in there, if you don't get lucky enough to get 3200. Now this is the CPU socket itself, and here's what's nice. See these 2 clips right here? These are the old style AM3 hooks. Do you have an older CPU cooler that does not support the new AM4 platform? These are the hooks from the old style, so you can simply hook them right there. Or you would undo these 4 screws, these will come completely off, and then you have the 4 mounting holes for the new AM4 style coolers. Now we do have one heatsink here, and yes, that is metal, not decorative plastic, and that is cooling the voltage regulator modules. There is not, however, one up here. If you've watched my higher end boards, my $140, $160 motherboards, they all have a strip of metal that runs all the way around, or 2 pieces. For overclocking, this board is probably not going to get quite as high of an overclock as, say, a $150 board will. That's because the power phase delivery and the cooling of the voltage regulator modules is lower than it is on the more expensive boards. It's one of the things you give up when you go to a budget board. That's not to say you can't overclock at all, but you probably aren't going to get a solid 4 gigahertz on all 4, 6, or 8 cores on Ryzen processors on this board. You probably can get maybe 3.8 on all the cores if you have an aftermarket cooler. If you buy this CPU and put a Hyper 212 Evo on it, 3.7 or 3.8 fixed on all 4 cores is probably possible on this board. I don't think 4.0 is. I'll try it. We'll see. We'll have to see what happens after the build video. But just keep in mind that that's one of the limitations of a budget board. Now, as far as the rest of the board, there are 2 1X PCI Express slots here, which I'm willing to bet virtually none of you will ever use. And along the bottom, we have a variety of other connectors, which I will cover in detail in the build video. One last thing. There is, this is nice. There is an 8-pin CPU power connector up here. A lot of budget boards only have a 4-pin connector. This will aid somewhat with overclocking and make sure that we can deliver all of the amperage, all the power we need for our socket. So basically the only real limitation here is going to be the voltage regulator modules and the power phase delivery on the board itself. Looking at the back of the board, we have a fairly simple layout. I want to make something clear. If you have a 2-speaker sound system, or a 2+1, meaning 2 stereo speakers and a subwoofer under the desk, this is fine. The Realtek audio on here will do the job just fine. A few years ago, it would have been the top tier premium audio. Today, it's a budget audio. It's an 800 series Realtek chip rather than the 1200 series of the higher end boards. But if you just have standard stereo speakers, or if you just have, for example, stereo speakers plus a sub, it's all you need. Please note that while this sound chip technically supports full surround sound, it doesn't have the plugs to plug everything into it to really support it. So this board would be really inappropriate for, say, a 5.1 or a 7.1 full surround sound system. If you have that kind of thing, spend more on your board. But if you just have 2 speakers and a subwoofer, it'll be just fine, or headphones. Then you have your gigabit Ethernet here provided by Realtek. You have several USB 3.0 and 3.1 ports. Now there are video ports here, but let me make absolutely clear. There's no onboard graphics on Ryzen 5 or Ryzen 7. This does not work on this board with that CPU installed. This is for the future APUs. In about 6 months or so, give or take, we don't have any official acknowledgement of dates or times, but we know they're coming. AMD said they're coming. They're going to be coming out with APUs, basically Ryzen processors with integrated graphics built into them. Those will work in these boards, and that's what these ports are for. They're to allow the boards to stay the same for when Ryzen chips with integrated graphics called APUs rather than CPUs come out. But right now, if you buy one of these don't work. You have to install a graphics card. And then we have there it is, a combo PS2 keyboard and mouse port if you have an old school keyboard or mouse that uses the PS2 port. Beyond that, that's pretty much everything on the board. It's pretty straightforward. It's not overly complex. It's a nice looking board, I think. It's red and black accents. It does have red LEDs on it. It is not RGB, just to make absolutely clear. So it will light up a bit, although you can turn that. You should be able to turn that off in the BIOS, but it's not RGB, but for $80 you shouldn't expect it to be. So there you have it, $80 for an excellent overclockable micro ATX motherboard. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with that big huge red button directly below, especially to receive notifications of the build video of this. Remember to leave your comments in the comment section below, and please, if you found this video useful, check the video description below. Links to Amazon and Newegg for this board and this CPU will be down there. Compare prices, buy it where it makes the most sense for you. You will also find links to all of my motherboard reviews down there. Interested in seeing higher end motherboards, what you get with them? Check them out down there and you'll see those as well. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in my next video.